Hello, and welcome to Game Gems. Today, we're going to take a quick look at a fundamental bit of programming, getters and setters. At its most basic, a getter, or setter, is simply a function that gets called when you get, or set, the value of a variable. In fancy nerd talk, this is because all data types, including so-called primitives like integers and booleans in high-level languages, are actually classes, and the only way you're allowed to interact with their properties is via public methods. The assignment operators, such as the addition operator, the plus sign, are overloaded such that the compiler knows that when you type that plus sign, it should call the object's getter methods to query their values, add them, and then, via the assignment operator, or equals, call the setter of the variable those values are being assigned to. Crazy shit, but why do we care? Well, because languages like C# or GDScript expose the ability to define those getters and setters to us, the programmer, in order to do all sorts of cool things. Imagine you have a variable, and whenever that variable changes, you need to do things like update the UI or call a function. You could just either insist that the variable is only ever modified in one place and do those updates there, or simply copy-paste the things you need to do to all those places where the variable is changed, but this is tedious and prone to errors, especially if you hire a new guy and forget to tell him, or simply forget yourself because hey, we're only human. Well, most of us anyway. Anyway, let's look at the syntax of getters and setters, and then we'll see some common use cases. A getter, or setter, is defined as a part of the variable definition and is tacked on the end just after the variable type, although the variable type itself is not necessary. The main difference is that the getter returns a value and the setter sets either the variable itself or another variable entirely, or no variable at all, to the value passed in the method. This last bit is important because although most programmers, especially beginners, assume getters and setters must directly modify the variable they're defined as a part of, all they really are is a streamlined way of defining a function. First, getters. At its most basic, a getter returns the value of the variable it's tied to. In GDScript, this is vaguely pointless because variables cannot be made private. Normally, in a language like C#, you would use a getter to control access to a private variable within the class. A more common and useful way to use a getter is to calculate, modify, or format the value that you're returning. For example, let's say that we have an integer value representing a character's ability scores in an RPG. For whatever reason, we want to cap the ability score at, say, 9999. But we have equipment that modifies the score and can push it above that cap. We can't just not apply the modifications because that will cause the score to get out of sync internally, but we also don't want the routines that use the score in their calculations to work with the uncapped value. So we create a getter that returns the lower of the two numbers, either the capped value or the actual value. Now, before we move on, it's important to note getters and setters are only for external access. This prevents us from running into problems when we try to use the variable's value in the setter, as we're about to see. Speaking of setters, let's look at those next. As previously stated, setters are called when setting the value of a variable. The value the script is attempting to set it to is passed into the setter via the value parameter, and we can choose to either set the variable to that value or not. We can also modify it prior to setting or set the variable to a different value entirely based on what gets passed in. For example, let's again assume we have a character with a hit point total, and that total can't exceed some arbitrary maximum. We can use the min method, again, to set the character's hit points to the lesser of the two values, the one passed in or the cap, whichever is lower. Another incredibly useful, use of the setter is to broadcast the fact that the variable has changed via a signal. Any other node that needs to care about the value of this variable can simply connect to that signal and then do whatever it needs to do when that signal is fired. Make sure you pass the new value of the variable as a parameter of that signal, though. This is absolutely invaluable for things like monitoring whether or not a character dies when their health hits 0, or just echoing a value to the UI. Getters and setters should become a basic part of your game dev vocabulary, if they're not already. Got any other clever uses for them that I might have missed? Make your presence known in the comments below, and of course don't forget to like and subscribe for more game gems. See you next time.